Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Real History. I am your host, History Professor Jared Frederick. If you haven't done so already, please hit that subscribe button below, leave a comment, and we welcome you to join our channel and see all the great content that we have. I have something slightly different lined up for this episode of Real History. As our faithful viewers are aware, we analyze history versus Hollywood on this channel. But given that the American Civil War is one of my passions and areas of expertise, I couldn't but help to share some thoughts on Alex Garland's latest film entitled Civil War, which is in many ways a dystopian nightmare, yet very effective filmmaking. I saw the film fairly recently, and I think it's one of the most terrifying movies I have ever seen. Terrifying because of its realism, the sort of lethal potentials that it poses in its narrative. Despite how brutal the film was, I think cinematically it was very effective because it does in fact get the key point across that the director was striving for. We'll reflect on that more in just a moment. But as I was watching Civil War, I could not but help draw parallels between the fictitious Civil War that was depicted in this movie versus the actual American Civil War, which I've dedicated many years of my life to studying. What I'd like to do is to highlight 5 key themes that stood out to me from a historical standpoint. The first of these was the centrality of national capitals. Geography plays a very important role in this film, just as it did in the actual American Civil War. And I don't think I'm giving too much away to highlight the fact that there are some very intense urban combat scenes that are depicted in this movie. Many of which take place in the District of Columbia itself, and that is depicted in the trailer as such. This drew my mind to the likes of the Battle of Fredericksburg, where civilians were, in some cases, indiscriminately targeted in December of 1862, but it also reminded me of the importance of both Washington, D.C., and Richmond as the American Civil War was underway. Much like how we see Washington and the White House itself in the film, in the 1860s, Washington, D.C. was the most fortified city on planet Earth. There was a string of dozens of fortifications that encircled the city. And this is so because of this supreme symbolic significance that we attach to national capitals. And the same is also true for the Confederate capital in Richmond, Virginia. And if we look at a map of that theater of war, we can see that the greater Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania area are smack dab right between the two national capitals. And in that vicinity throughout the war, some 100,000 casualties were inflicted. So once again, geography is a very important trait of all of this. And as we have discussed in many Civil War movies, the landscape is also a character in this movie. And irony of ironies, many of the urban combat scenes depicting this fictional fighting in Washington, D.C., was actually filmed in Atlanta, which was truly destroyed by total war during our Civil War in the year 1864. Number 2, the power of photography. One of the things that I really liked about this movie, not only a lot of the nuance that could be found in it, but also the fact that some of the key protagonists in the movies were journalists and also combat photographers and correspondents. In my book, Dispatches of D-Day, that is something that I look into a lot, how war zones are reported and how that information is shared with the masses. But as we look back to the Civil War, we can firmly acknowledge that this is one of the first major wars in human history that is thoroughly photographed. And a lot of the horror that is depicted in this movie, I think in many cases, is matched not only by conflicts that we see in civil wars all throughout the world, but in some of the very first battlefield casualties depicted in Civil War photography. And as that is shown in the movie, my mind was drawn back to an editorial in 1862 in the New York Times, responding to an exhibit put on by Civil War era photographer Matthew Brady after he and his associates visited the Antietam battlefield in 1862. And the New York Times said this: "Mr. Brady has done something to bring home to us the terrible reality and earnestness of war. If he has not brought bodies and laid them in our dooryards and along the streets, he has done something very like it." And of course, what we see in this film is that a far larger number of civilians are not spared that misery because there are literal bodies in their streets. Number 3, allegiance and retaliation. Notions of loyalty are fundamentally important in this movie, as they were in the 1860s. And especially if you lived in the border states, a place like Missouri or Kansas or Maryland or Kentucky, sometimes it could be just as dangerous to not declare your allegiance. But one of the things that I did in my previous life, I spent a lot of time working and also volunteering at Harpers Ferry National Historical Park. And that is one of those dangerous borderland areas where people's loyalties were constantly flipping depending upon which military force occupied the town. And we see that same sort of complexity playing out in this movie. And one story that reminds me of this, especially the scene that we see with Jesse Plemons, who is this very vigilante, ruthless killer type of character. Somebody like him seems almost ripped out of the pages of history. And I think of one such individual who was a Confederate guerrilla fighter by the name of Sweet Johnny Moberly, who lived and fought and pillaged in the greater Harpers Ferry area during the American Civil War. And he was characterized by one of his contemporaries, he and his men, as a reckless band of cutthroats and marauders, robbing every soldier they came across, stealing horses from the citizens, and committing all sorts of daring depredations. And thus the volatile nature of how the Civil War is playing out in that part of the country leads to indiscriminate killings, thievery, and everything else horrific and imaginable. We see a version of that playing out in Garland's Civil War. But as to Sweet Johnny, even local people in his area grew frustrated with his exploits, and they collaborated with U.S. cavalry to set an ambush, which is ultimately what happened to him. And he was caught in a trap. He was shot 3 times through the head, and then the U.S. forces hauled his corpse back to Harpers Ferry, where it was put on public display. So we often think of the American Civil War as this gentleman's war. It's one of genteel officers and whatnot, but there is a horrible, ruthless, cutthroat, neighbor versus neighbor formula to it that is all too often overlooked. And certainly we are not spared any activities like that in this most recent cinematic interpretation of Civil War 2.0. Number 4, the symbolism of the American Civil War. Throughout the movie, the front lines are described as in the vicinity of Charlottesville, Virginia. And I don't see that as a coincidence when taking into account the controversial and violent Unite the Right rally that took place in Charlottesville in 2017, all of which was in many ways focused around the impending removal of a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. And therefore, Charlottesville has become an important and contested place in the historical memory of the Civil War. Additionally, and once again, I don't think I'm spoiling too much here because we see it in the trailer, we see the destruction of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. And once again, I see this as a very symbolic gesture on the part of the filmmaker, because what that scene highlights is the very fracturing of the Union that Abraham Lincoln strived to save. Number 5, don't do this again. I think this is the main message that director Alex Garland is trying to convey. And for as much as I've studied the Civil War, it's at times very easy to separate ourselves just by virtue of time and distance in that regard. But this was a movie that clarified to me the utmost horror that civil wars unleash, whether real, fictional, domestic, or international. And I think it goes to prove that nobody should preach for civil war or separation or secession in any sort of cavalier manner ever. As one other reviewer of the film said, a civil war is not LARPing. It's not a time to be macho and cool and think that you're awesome. What a civil war does is that it unleashes, in many cases, the worst of human instincts. And with our American Civil War, that is perhaps an exception and not the norm, because at least out of all of this death and devastation, we have the preservation of the Union and the destruction of slavery. But just like political revolutions, oftentimes civil wars only make things worse off than what they originally were. This is the lesson that we should walk away with. And as I was thinking of this, I was reminded of a quote by the first Secretary of War of the Confederacy named Leroy Pope Walker, who rather infamously said at the outset of the Civil War that all the blood shed as a result of secession will be wiped up with a handkerchief. And it was that sort of naivete in 1861 that made Americans exceedingly ill-prepared for the major bloodletting that was on the horizon. These are the cautionary words, warnings, and tales that we must ever be mindful of as we think about the political division within our own time. With all that said, I thank you for joining us on this very different episode of Real History, but I couldn't help but to share some historical context that this movie made me think about. Thanks for joining us, and until we see you next time here on Real History, stay curious.